You're listening to Venus in Retrocast, a tarot podcast for the astro-curious. I'm your host, Brandi Spradling. Each week, I explore how to deepen your understanding of the tarot using methods in astrology. Together, we're going to strengthen our relationships with ourselves and each other. So let's get into it and read some tarot, retro style. Hello and welcome back for another week of Venus in Retrocast. I am so grateful that you're here and the warm reception that I've received and the comments that I've received about the first episode last week on the Fool. So I really just wanted to express that and say that I appreciate everyone who listened and who is really vibing with this podcast. It's really a labor of love and I'm so grateful, and I'm so excited that I had these insights and concepts that I could share with you all. So this week we're going to talk about the Magician, and it's ruled by the planet Mercury. So if you're unfamiliar with astrology, Mercury is the planet of communication. Our thinking, the way that we analyze and process information, the way that we speak, are all related to Mercury. The way that we learn, what we're curious about, our ideas are all Mercury. It's the fastest moving planet in the solar system. So when we talk about mercurial energy, it's often quick and reflexive. The way that we process information as individuals is highly unique when we look at it through the lens of our personal astrology. So that means whatever sign that your Mercury is in your natal chart, and the aspects that it makes are what lend themselves to your unique style of communication and the way you perceive the world and make meaning of it. So when we talk about the Magician in relation to its rulership by the planet Mercury, the question I ask instantly when I pull the Magician is, what wants to come through your channel, or what wants to come through my channel when I'm giving myself a reading? The figure in the card is a conduit between the otherworldly and the earthly realms. They hold a wand pointed upward in their right hand toward the cosmic realm, and they point their finger downward with the left toward the underworld, while they stand right here rooted on the earthly plane. They're demonstrating the maxim of as above, so below. The Magician's energy is active and expressive like Mercury. Think about how the body functions. Let's use that as an example. If the body is a computer, the brain and the mind are the motherboard. The brain sends signals almost instantaneously to the rest of our bodies that tell us to breathe, to pull our hand away from a hot stove, to blink, just the way the motherboard of a computer sends signals to all the other parts of the computer to make it function. A computer is comprised of lots of little tiny parts. It has a monitor, there's a processor, the keyboard. All of those pieces you can think of them in Magician terms as tools that make the computer run. And in the same way, on the Magician card, there are tools on the Magician's table that correspond with each of the elements. On the table is a wand, a chalice or a cup, a sword, and a pentacle. And they each correspond with the suits of the Minor Arcana, which I hope to get into next season. Ultimately, we can't make any use of these tools without the executive functioning of our unique channels, or our brains, essentially. We're all channelers, so I want to dispense with that notion that some people are able to channel energy and others aren't. It just expresses itself differently. So the way that we channel our unique experiences and wisdom into the world is as unique as our fingerprints. So when we pull the Magician, it's telling us, okay, you have these tools on your table. You have everything you need. And how are you going to use them? And it's no coincidence that both of the zodiac signs that represent Mercury are mutable signs. Mutable signs are very changeable. And the way that this plays out is different for both of those signs. Mercury is the ruler of both Gemini and Virgo. Gemini is an air sign and Virgo is an earth sign. So the way that these energies play out is very different. But both of these signs govern areas of the mind and how we think and communicate. I like to think of the mutable signs as each having duality, and actually all four of the signs that we're going to talk about today are mutable signs. But right now I'm going to focus on Gemini and Virgo. And I think of mutability as a choice. So when we're talking about mercurial energy, and that corresponding with Gemini and Virgo, we're talking about whether they're going to make the choice to use their channel as a way to connect with others and build bridges, or as a way to manipulate and sow chaos, or anywhere in between on that spectrum. The mottos for Gemini and Virgo are I think and I analyze, respectively. And sometimes even with Virgo, it's I scrutinize. So we can think about how their communication and thought processes can be used to lift others up or to put them down. As with any sign in astrology, there are always examples of people in pop culture and history, and I absolutely love pop culture, so you'll hear me talk about it a lot. But there are people that have every sign that exemplify the highest and the lowest form. So I kind of wanted to talk about that and list off some celebrities that I think exemplify the highest and lowest form of these signs where Mercury is at home. So let's start with Gemini. Some of the people that I looked up that I think exemplify Gemini in the highest form are Tupac Shakur, John F. Kennedy, Anne Frank. There's Prince, Bob Dylan, Morgan Freeman, Lenny Kravitz, Kendrick Lamar. The way that they communicate is very powerful, and whether it was on the political stage, through music, or, through Anne Frank, through her writing, were very influential, and they, their words were powerful, and they were used, to bring people together or to educate them, as Anne Frank did with, she was such a young child, but documenting the Holocaust, that is something that, is invaluable to society, and the way that we, think about and remember, those who suffered through such a horrible time in world history. And on the opposite side of that spectrum, some of the Geminis that I personally think exemplify the lowest form of the zodiac sign are obviously Donald Trump and Mike Pence. They're both Geminis. Bill Barr, Johnny Depp, Kanye West, Rudy Giuliani, and Shia LaBeouf. And each of these people have been in the news, obviously, like either on the political stage or through pop culture, and they exemplify the ways that the lowest form of Gemini can use their words to hurt people, use their words to manipulate systems and situations. If you look at the justice system and the way that our government functioned during the Trump administration, Donald Trump, Mike Pence, Bill Barr, Rudy Giuliani all played a part in the destruction of democracy as we know it and the way that we're trying to put it together. And then when we look at figures like Kanye West, he played a part in that as well. And, he uses his words, in a very narcissistic way. And, there were times in the past where he was a higher manifestation of that Gemini energy, where, if you think about what happened in Hurricane Katrina, and he spoke out and said, George Bush doesn't care about black people. Like, that was a huge moment where people were not expecting him to use his voice. And then, on the flip side, he propped up an administration that did great harm to people who look like him, and also people who suffer with mental illnesses as he does. But he is a famous person with power and privilege who allowed himself to be used by people who wanted to do harm and do evil. And when you look at people like Johnny Depp and Shia LaBeouf, they're both very abusive with their words and their actions, but they are what I would consider a lower form of that Gemini mercurial energy. So let's look at some notable Virgos who I think exemplify the sign in its highest form. And obviously, I am going to shout Beyonce first and foremost, because we worship Beyonce in this house. The author Paulo Coelho, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, but I really enjoy his writings. Michael Jackson, Freddie Mercury, Padma Lakshmi, Idris Elba, love him, Bernie Sanders, Bruce Springsteen, Stephen King, Jack Black, and Amy Winehouse. And I think that even with all of the struggles that Amy Winehouse went through, her music was really, transformative and, really analytical of the way that she struggled with addiction, and I think that is something that we, should talk about more as a society, and the ways that, she was kind of speaking these things out loud, and she was mocked for it in her life and celebrated after her death, and that's something where when we talk about Virgo and their sensitivities and their nervous systems, and, how that can bring about a proneness to addiction, honestly, when you're trying to soothe and medicate yourself. Obviously I'm digressing a little bit, and we're going to talk more about Virgo later in the second half of the show, but that was just something that came to mind, that Virgos can be, very sensitive, and that energy has to have a way to be properly channeled and managed, or it really can go awry. So with that being said, let's move on to Virgos that I think are a lower manifestation. And I love Virgos so much, I had a harder time coming up with as much of a list than I did with Geminis, but I'm probably biased because I'm a Virgo rising. But some of the people that I came up with are Armie Hammer. So if you've been paying attention to any celebrity news lately, Armie Hammer has been in the news for communications, that are quite disturbing and abusive. And that is something, where that analytical energy, like, he really did not channel that in the best way, to make people feel safe. Van Jones, Tommy Tuberville, who played a very integral role in what happened on January 6th with the riot at the Capitol, the insurrection at the Capitol, Mike Huckabee, who is also a prominent Republican who supported the Trump administration. George Wallace, the, old Southern Dixiecrat politician who was, quite racist and, harmful to racial justice movements and the body politic in general. And Ryan Phillippe, who also he's an actor, and if you don't know who he is, who has a history of abuse. So those are some of the lower forms of the Virgo energy that the magician can channel. So now we're going to move on and talk about the actual cards where Mercury is in domicile. And those are the Lovers and the Hermit. And I'm mostly going to talk about the Lovers here, where Gemini is at home, because Virgo is also the sign where Mercury is exalted. So I'd like to save that conversation for the second half of this lesson. So let's talk about what the Lovers means and how that relates to the sign of Gemini. To me, the Lovers is the sacred mirror. So really, Gemini are the twins in the zodiac. So when we're looking at someone else and we recognize something in them, what I think that when we pull the Lovers, what that means is we're seeing a reflection of something within ourselves that we recognize in another. Often in tarot, because of the name of this card, the Lovers is talked about in a romantic context. And that can be true, but not always. When we think about the sign of Gemini and how it rules the third house in astrology, it can include our siblings, our immediate community, our friends. Friends are more in the 11th house with Aquarius, but we're going to get to that as well. But really, it is any kind of relationship that you have with another person. And it doesn't even have to necessarily be a one-on-one. It could be your relationship to your environment. It could be your relationship to your faith, your church, if you are practicing, or if you are part of a coven, how you relate to the group as a whole, or, how you relate to certain people. Like, what do you see in your environment that reflects something within yourself? And sometimes we don't always recognize that right away. We can sometimes react rather than reflect. And that is where a little bit of the Hermit energy is going to come in, that I'm going to talk about later on. But since we're talking about the Lovers being that sacred mirror into ourselves, when we think about the Lovers and the Magician working with those energies together, what it's really saying is that, we can channel our best selves and communicate that. And especially if, there's a person that we're interacting with, a friend or a lover or, an acquaintance, someone we meet on the street, that really is important information that we're not only giving to someone else, our energy, our thoughts, but that we're receiving. And when we think about the motto of Gemini being, I think, what is it, the information that we're receiving, whether it's verbal or nonverbal, in the context of communication, how does that recognition reflect the ways that I think and act and interact with the world? Is it the highest reflection of how I want to be seen? Or is it lower? Because sometimes we recognize our bad habits in another person, or we may want to project those bad habits onto another person as a way to not own, our own stuff. So the Magician and the Lovers is really saying, like, do we want to channel our highest selves? And also, does our environment, do our relationships, do our friendships the way that we interact with even our own family. Does that bring out the best in us, or does it give us a reflection of what it is that we want to root out in our lives that may, like we talked about in last week when we talked about the death card, does it provide a mirror into what needs to go on the scrap heap of our lives, what needs to be offered up to the fire? The Lovers is card 6 in the Major Arcana. And even with the Minor Arcana, any 6 I think of as a reciprocal energy because of that connection with the Lovers. We're giving and receiving. So we are communicating through our channel, and we're also receiving energy from others. So when you pull the Magician and the Lovers together, ask yourself, or ask the querent that you're reading for, what information are you channeling in your environment? And also what's being reflected back to you from the people in your life and in your community. Is it an accurate reflection of who you really are? Or is it something that needs to be tweaked and changed so that it's in alignment with who you are authentically and who you want to become in the future? So the next card that I want to talk about in relation to the Magician is Temperance in reverse. Temperance is ruled by the zodiac sign Sagittarius, and Sagittarius is where Mercury is in its detriment. Sagittarius is ruled by Jupiter. So when you think about Mercury and Jupiter being opposite each other, Mercury is really focused on details, and Sagittarius being Jupiter and the planet of expansion and the sign of expansion, it is more focused on the big picture. So you can see why Mercury in Sagittarius would be considered in its detriment. But again, I want to remind you, any planet that's in its detriment, I don't think is a, air quotes, bad thing. I think those energies sometimes conflict, and often where there's tension, there's innovation, because think about that old axiom, need is the mother of all invention. Like when there are challenging things in our chart, or a challenging placement where the planet and the sign somewhat speak different languages, it can offer a way for us to work with those energies in a way that is divergent from the norm. And often that's really innovative and beautiful. So when we talk about temperance in the reverse, let's talk about what it means in the upright just briefly. So temperance is card number 14 in the tarot, in the Major Arcana, and it really deals with finding a sense of balance and moderation after we come out of the death process in card 13. The figure in the card is an angel with wings. They're pouring cups, water from one cup to another in an angle that really is impossible in terms of physics. The angel has 1 foot in the water and 1 foot on land, which is a symbol of balancing, being rooted, and also staying in connection with our emotional selves. The sign of Sagittarius is related to Jupiter being expansive. And in that way, we can think of temperance in reverse as a lack of moderation or an inability to regulate, or, it can be too much or not enough. Jupiter kind of cuts both ways. It's the planet of luck, but it's also known for being a planet of excess. And that is something that Sagittarius as a sign and an archetype really comes to this life with, that challenge of learning how to moderate some of their more adventurous and risk-taking, and often in its lowest form, dogmatic, tendencies. So temperance in reverse, especially when we're thinking about it in terms of its relation to Mercury and the magician being a channeler, and temperance in reverse saying, like, how do I moderate? How do I maintain that sense of balance where it can be very hard to do that at certain times? It's like, am I allowing my beliefs to be malleable and changeable? Or am I being a little bit rigid? So we can think of that in terms of, the ninth house, which is what Sagittarius rules, a lot of religion and different belief systems, how they can be used either, for the betterment of society, or they can be used as a destructive force in the way that they communicate their messages. And there are high and low forms of each. So if we look at Christianity, there have been many points in history where it's been used to justify atrocities. It was used to justify slavery. It's used currently to try to deny access to reproductive care, based on the beliefs of a few, trying to control, the bodies of others. And that is, the way that Christianity, and that's only, a couple of examples, can be used to, those tools that they have, the access that they have, what they're channeling is not in the best interest of a progressive society, because they are basically talking over the people who want access to choice. And even to this day, slavery exists in other forms. Look at the criminal justice system in America. It has become its own form of modern day slavery. Inmates are forced to work for cents, a few cents an hour if they're paid at all. And the access to fairness in the legal system, which also is encompassed with the ninth house, how it's not even across the board, and how certain people's perceptions of a group of people, whether they be black or brown or Muslim or lower class, how dogma can be used to channel harmful stereotypes and misinformation and misconceptions about people who are often the most marginalized and unprotected in society. Look at the conspiracy theory around QAnon, and how that influence has really brainwashed people, and it's become kind of a religion in itself, where people are manipulated, and that is very, magician in reverse, into believing things that are absolutely false and creating a different reality. That, I think that is something where, when you look at the magician and you look at temperance in reverse, it's like, how can communication be used to bring out the worst excesses in people, or the worst expression of that communication? But then also, you can look at the ways in which, in pulling temperance in the reverse, how it can ask you to use the magician as a resource and a reminder to ask yourself, am I being ethical in my communication? And is my personal philosophy in alignment with who I am? And remember, Sagittarius can be too much or not enough. So am I talking when I should be listening? Or am I speaking over others when really what I need to do is pass the mic to others who are not normally listened to in society? And that could be Black women, it could be trans community, it could be the disabled, it can be undocumented folks. So many people get talked over who really need to be listened to in order to really affect change. So Temperance in reverse is asking you to consider, is the narrative that you've learned and been indoctrinated in from, your community or your life experiences, is it in alignment with what you want to put out into the world? And are there any ways that you perceive the world and communicate that cause harm and possibly need to change? So that's my take on Temperance in reverse and the Magician, and how when Temperance in reverse comes up, you can think of it as where Mercury is in detriment, and how you can look to the Magician for clues and insights in how to work with this energy. So now we're going to take a little break, and then we're going to come back and talk about the Hermit and the Moon in reverse. So don't go anywhere because you don't want to miss it. Are you looking for a foundational course in tarot that's free and readily available? I'd like to introduce you to a podcast called Rootlock Radio, hosted by my friend and mentor, Weston. The entire first season lays a great foundation for anyone who is new to tarot, or even if you're a seasoned tarot reader. He's a whiz at establishing systems that make tarot practical and accessible. If you're already a Rootlock Radio listener, you know exactly what I mean. If not, what are you waiting for? Go subscribe to his podcast and learn from one of the best tarot readers I know. The link for Weston's podcast and Instagram are in the show notes, so go check it out now. And welcome back. So now we're going to talk about where Mercury is exalted, and that's in the sign of Virgo. So let's talk a little bit about some of the characteristics of Virgo. It's the sign that's associated with being analytical and methodical. And often Virgos can be critical, they're really health conscious, and exacting. Don't forget, the other motto that they use for Virgo is I scrutinize. So it's the more grounded side of Mercury, being that it's an earth sign, as opposed to the airy social qualities of Gemini. Virgo is associated with the 6th house in astrology, and that's the house of our health, our work, our daily routine, and it's the house of service. In the sign of Virgo, Mercury notices everything. They notice the subtleties, the intricacies, the complexities of people around them and their environment. So in that way, they're very similar to Gemini, because Gemini is that reflective energy, that mirror energy, and Virgo is the observer. So they don't miss a beat. They're masters of pattern recognition, which in my view makes them more intuitive than they get credit for. And actually, I think that goes for all the zodiac signs. Usually, water signs are the ones that are talked about in the realm of intuition and psychic ability. But I think that each zodiac sign has its own way of expressing their flavor of intuition. But that's a topic for another episode, and I'm sure that I'll do that sometime in the future. So moving on, the sign of Virgo corresponds with the Hermit in the Major Arcana. And I like to think that if the Magician were a baby witch learning how to hone their craft, then the Hermit is the more experienced, practical witch that the Magician seeks out to deepen their knowledge and understanding. The Hermit, corresponding with Virgo, exhibits their desire to be of service. And it's in its highest form when they recognize that they've once been that young magician, and along their journey they've encountered hermits of their own who have taught them how to be introspective and how to reflect and turn inward. The hermit teaches the magician how to use the tools on their table in a way that enhances their own unique style that wants to come through their channel. So in my opinion, this is the hermit in its highest form. Beyond that, the hermit reminds us that we all need moments of solitude to go inward and reflect, and to be our own hermits in a sense, to remind ourselves to take that time for introspection. And this can take on many forms, not just meditation, because I know a lot of people point to meditation as a way to turn inward, and that's not always something that is the most helpful method, depending on what background you come from or what intersections you have in your daily life. So other ways that we can reflect and use tools, like if we're thinking about the tools on the magician's table, it can be journaling. That's a sword. It can be expressing our feelings through song or listening to music. I think of that as very cups energy. Using wands energy of fire is really doing something that you're passionate about that turns on that inner spark. And pentacles energy is grounding. So there are many ways that we can do that. And, if it's accessible to you, getting outside and, putting your bare feet on the grass, or doing things that involve gentle movement, like yoga and especially trauma-informed yoga. I have learned about tapping in therapy, and a friend of mine even introduced me to a couple of YouTubers that have videos where they do guided tapping sessions. So, that is a way to get in touch with your body. And coming back to swords energy, something that occurred to me is scream therapy. Like, that is something that I think is really interesting, because sometimes we just need to let that nervous energy out of our body, or that angry energy, and like screaming into a pillow or just screaming out loud, like that is very swords energy to me, because it is a form of communication, but we're also moving that energy through ourselves. The key is to use Mercury's energy in a way that's affirming of yourself and affirming of others if you're part of their support system. One of Virgo's challenges is that their highly observant nature can turn into being overly critical, and mostly they direct their energy at themselves. I'm a Virgo rising, so I am very familiar with that. I can be my best cheerleader and my harshest critic. If a Virgo wants to, they can use their words to absolutely eviscerate and decimate someone. It's something that they are uniquely skilled at. And I'm not saying that to shade any Virgos, because there are times that call for that. That it's a power that they need to remember to wield to empower others that need their gifts, and save the shadowy side of Mercury, to dismantle systems of oppression, because the fact that they have such an exacting and observant nature means that they often see what others might miss. So the hermit being of service and using that energy as a magician is really using that gift of analysis to dismantle those systems of oppression. And that's how I like to think about, that in the context of Virgo being of service to the collective. I want to give an honorable mention to Mercury in Aquarius here. This opinion is completely my own, although it may have been mentioned by others, but I think Mercury could have co-exaltation, if you will, and I put that in air quotes, and that would be in Aquarius. Aquarius is related to the 11th house and the sign of the collective consciousness. And Uranus is also the higher octave of Mercury. So although there's no traditional astrological basis for it, I think Aquarius would be a really good place for Mercury to be exalted. Aquarians are brilliant and they're futuristic thinkers, and that Uranian energy makes lightning fast connections. So with Aquarius's correspondence to the star, it's almost as if the star is saying to the magician, okay, you're at your best when you're channeling your energy and you use your tools in service of something greater than yourself. So pick up your tools, get to work, and do something that pushes the collective into the future that we want to live in. The collective is best served by living in a society that's diverse and anti-oppressive, one that is rooted not only in equality, but restorative justice and reparations, especially for communities that have been exploited and destroyed by institutions like colonization, capitalism, and slavery. I could go on, but you get my point. That is very Aquarian. Like, they want to actually channel that into action. So now we're going to talk about where Mercury is in its fall, and that's the sign of Pisces. And I'm going to stress again that challenging aspects and placements are not a sign of doom, and they're not a bad thing. I actually love this placement, and as we talk about it, you'll see why. The sign of Pisces is ruled by Neptune, and Neptune is the planet of transcendence. So it's said that whatever Neptune touches, it dissolves or diffuses. In the sign of Pisces, Mercury is less concerned with concrete facts and relies more on intuition. Mercury in Pisces is very dreamy and creative, and often you'll see a lot of artists and poets have Mercury in Pisces, or their Mercury makes aspects to Neptune that gives it that Pisces flavor. So in the sign of Pisces, Mercury is turned on its head. It's more compassionate, empathetic, and its healing nature is turned up 1,000%. Where Mercury's nature as a planet is more intellectual, Pisces' nature as a sign is more mystical. So I want you to visualize something for me. Picture the sign of Pisces as a house. When you enter, everything's covered in low, soft lighting that makes the art, the furniture, each room look as if you're walking through a dream. Now imagine that Mercury is a house guest. They're on vacation. It's not at all like home, where Mercury is used to being able to see everything nice and clearly. There's natural lighting and everything is in its proper place. But Mercury is on vacation here in Pisces Airbnb, if you will. And one must adapt to their surroundings and make the most of it, right? So Mercury feels uneasy with what it can't see and make sense of. And this is a lot like the moon card in the Major Arcana, which corresponds with Pisces. In moon energy, we can feel like we're in the dark, and we don't really know what's going on. And often when we can't see what's going on, we feel uneasy about that. The water is murky in the moon card, so we may feel freaked out and afraid of what lies beneath the surface of that water. And the water is very representative of our subconscious. Each of the cards we've talked about give clues and suggestions for how to work with this energy. Since Mercury is in fall in Pisces, it often needs a boost from supporting energies that can help us work through it. So the Magician says to the moon to trust that you have everything that you need to make it through this period of uncertainty. Use the tools at your disposal. Call on your inner resources. Temperance asks you to find your balance. If you try to logic your way through a situation, or if you rely on your intuition when it's clouded, you're leaning too much on one and not enough on the other. Kind of like what we talked about with Temperance in reverse, that it's usually too much or not enough with Jupiter energy when it's in its lowest form. So, do you feel like you can't do it alone? That's where the Hermit comes in. Find your Hermit figure that you can call on for help. And sometimes that Hermit energy can even be you calling on your guides, your higher self, or whatever it is that you believe in to help you step into that Hermit energy. Calling on the archetype itself to be a support to you. Calling on Hermit energy will allow you to reflect, embrace a period of introspection where you maybe feel isolated, but it is a journey that you have to go on alone, and regain your center. So sometimes it can be hard to sit still and sit in the discomfort of the unknown, but the sun eventually will come out, and the Hermit's wisdom can help you see that when you're in the murkiness, in the darkness, feel like you're in that moon energy where things seem distorted and out of whack. The Hermit reminds you that the sun will eventually come out, because the moon card is number 18. And then when we move to the sun, things are illuminated. So that is how I'm conceptualizing reading the Magician in the context of its astrological placement and the cards that I relate to it. And now we're going to take another break, and then we're going to come back with another listener question and a tarot reading. So don't go anywhere. Welcome back. It's time for our listener segment, and we got a write-in from Kelly, and she's from New York City. Her sun, moon, and rising are Aries sun, Pisces moon, and Capricorn rising, and she's asking about her Saturn return. So here's what Kelly writes. I turned 28 this year, and I'm also graduating from grad school. My Saturn return has begun, and it's in my second house of finances. So my question is, what do I need to keep in mind when it comes to job searching and my finances? And firstly, I want to say, Kelly, congratulations. Graduating from grad school is a big deal. So I just want to congratulate you on such a big accomplishment. So I pulled some cards for you, and I feel like the message that came out was really, really clear. So to get started, I wanted to anchor the reading with an oracle card. And the oracle card that I pulled for you says, Dream, build castles in the sky. And what this card refers to is connecting with your imaginative self, your inner child, and allowing yourself to dream, and I know that at a time where you're in the midst of your Saturn return and, you're really worried about security, or maybe not worried, but just wanting to set yourself up, for security, that it can be hard to allow yourself to dream and to lean into that. And in the book, I'm looking at the book for this, it says, remind yourself of your dreams, no matter how unattainable they may seem. nothing is impossible in this mysterious universe. So basically what this is telling me, especially since you have a lot of earth energy, just from looking at your sun, moon, and rising and the placement of your Saturn, that you're working with a lot of earth energy. And, the fact that you're a Capricorn rising, Saturn is your chart ruler. So this Saturn return for you is really extra important. But also being in one of its home signs of Aquarius, that, Saturn also is a co-ruler of Aquarius, that this is really, a time for you to establish yourself. So, that can look a lot like, especially with the second house placement, really wanting to make sure that you're set up financially. And sometimes that lends itself to kind of sacrificing what might, in your work life, what might be emotionally fulfilling in service of financial stability. And that makes sense because we live in a world where we need money, we need resources to survive. So the first card that came out for you that represents the central energy that you'll be working with and that's already present during your Saturn return is the Wheel of Fortune in reverse. And when the Wheel of Fortune is in reverse, there can sometimes be a feeling that the universe is throwing a lot of stuff at us. And it's really hard to let go and kind of stay centered. We might want to enforce our will on the universe, and that ends up backfiring. But it just can signify like a chance for you to learn how to let go of control a little bit. And that can be hard for somebody that has a lot of cardinal energy in their chart. Like just looking at your sun and your rising sign, you have Aries and you have Capricorn. So Aries really, wants to step out and make their mark. And Capricorn needs things to be in order. This is Saturn we're talking about. We want systems in place when we have prominent Capricorn placements. So it can be really hard to work with the Wheel of Fortune in reverse and learning how to just be with what is without trying to control the outcome too much. And the card that is crossing the Wheel of Fortune is the King of Cups. So the King of Cups is a blending of fire and of water. So that's present in your chart as well, being that you're a Pisces moon and an Aries sun. But what the King of Cups tells me is that ultimately you want to master how to live in a way that is aligned with your passions and also your emotional fulfillment. And then looking at the past influence card that's influencing the present is the Knight of Cups in reverse. And that to me just says that in the past you may have had to make sacrifices of what you truly wanted and were passionate about, or that really made you feel emotionally fulfilled, but in service of more of a stable energy. So, I can see how that past could really kind of lend itself to you being in this space of, what Saturn is trying to teach you during this, during your return, is to learn how to balance what you want and what you need. So that is really what I'm seeing with that. And then what card I pulled for you as your best course of action is the Four of Cups. So what the Four of Cups tells me is that you are going to have a really successful career outlook now that you're done with grad school. And you'll be able to really be discerning and be picky, as far as what you want your career to be. So what that tells me with the Four of Cups is that you don't have to necessarily accept the first offer that looks good or that looks like it will provide you security. Especially if it feels like in your gut it may not be what you want, that you can take time and contemplate, like, is this really what I want to do, or am I grasping at this because I feel like nothing better will come along? So your best course of action is really just to take time, and this is more cups energy, to contemplate, and, part of that is just telling people, like, let me think about it. And that can be hard in a time where we are, in the midst of a pandemic and, people are really focused on their security. Like it's a real running theme in this difficult time that we live in. But really what these cards are telling you is that you have the ability to be choosy. So what is grounding this energy is the Four of Swords. And I really love this card because what it says to me is that anytime that you feel like you're out of control, this Wheel of Fortune energy comes in and you're like, oh my God, like what next? Like the universe is throwing some other shit at me. Like how can I, grasp control of it? That's a good time. The Four of Swords tells us, to really ground our thoughts. Fours are all about stability. And it's also related to the Emperor card. So, that's you, that's Aries. Go back to, at the core, at the foundation, because fours are about that foundation. At the root, who am I? And with Saturn being in your second house, what do I value? So, really ground yourself in why you're doing what you're doing and what's truly important to you, because the rest doesn't matter. At the end of the day, you ultimately want to make choices that are going to be fulfilling for you and that affirm to yourself, like, that you're capable of having both security and happiness. So when you absorb the medicine of your Saturn return and also the medicine of the cards that are present in your spread, what can you expect life to look like? And that's what your final cards are. So I pulled the Queen of Swords in reverse for you, and I wanted a little bit of clarification. So I pulled another card, and I got the Death card. So what this tells me is that, I'm going to keep it real, that your Saturn return is going to be a bit of a challenge, and there's nothing wrong with that. Often when we are challenged the most is when we grow a lot. The Queen of Swords in the reverse is basically signaling that there may be times where you're going to feel really unsure of whether or not you're making the right decision. But the Death card is telling you that ultimately you have to trust that the process that you're going through, especially with the Wheel of Fortune being in your present, that it's a huge transformation and there are going to be a lot of changes. And when you come out of the other side of it, your life, it probably won't look anything like what it looks like right now, because everyone's Saturn return, but especially for you being a Capricorn rising, is a really transformative experience. We die to a lot of our old ways and we learn a lot of hard lessons, but we're reborn, older and wiser and more grounded in who we are as people and what we want out of life. So none of that is to scare you. I definitely don't want you to feel that way. It's just a heads up that this time will be challenging for you. But death ultimately serves our highest good. This card isn't about literal death. It's about transformation of the self, because it's card 13. And when you look at it from the standpoint of numerology, 1 and 3 together is 4. So it reduces back down to the Emperor of getting you closer to yourself and affirming yourself. So I have 2 more oracle cards for you. And one of them is, it says, what does your soul say? So basically that really is, that signal to live from your soul or make decisions that are more aligned with your soul rather than aligned with necessarily what others in your life may expect from you. And I pulled a card from another deck called the Arcana of Astrology, and I'll have a picture of your cards on my Instagram that goes along with this episode, so you can always check that out and look at your cards as well. But I pulled the Aquarius card, so this is so aligned with your Saturn return being in Aquarius. But what the advice of this card is to do something that's a little bit unpredictable and unexpected, and ultimately that will be fulfilling for you. It'll be fulfilling for your soul. What does your soul say? And like the first oracle card that I pulled, like dream, and allow your dreams to be something that is completely out of what you thought is possible. And even if you don't totally, get there at this time, and ultimately you have to make practical choices right now, that's okay. But to think long-term about what it is that you want and make those long-term plans to get there. Because Saturn does reward that. Saturn rewards those stepping stones and putting plans in place and really being disciplined about it. And that can take a long time, and that's okay. So that's what I'm getting from your reading. And I really hope that this was helpful, Kelly. You can always email me, or you can post on Instagram and let me know if this resonated with you. And I really, really want to thank you for writing in. So that is the show for today, everyone. And I thank you so much for joining me again. And I'll catch you next time. Take care, loves. Thanks for joining me this week on Venus and Retrocast. Make sure to visit my Instagram page at Venus and Retro Tarot for more amazing content. I post tarot spreads, collective readings, and connect with all of you. Make sure to subscribe on Anchor, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite podcast platform. If you found value in the show, I'd greatly appreciate a rating on iTunes, or tell a friend about the show. Any way you choose to support the podcast, I'm so grateful that you're here.